I think it's already 1:30. Let me start the class. Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening, depends where you are. It's my great honor to be the final speaker of this Tsinghua lecture series, Fine Traditional Chinese Culture. And today I'm going to talk about the history of logical thought in the context of comparing Chinese and Western traditions. Of course, this is a grand topic. I will not be able to cover everything, so I will only give you some glimpse. So this is my plan. I'll first give you some general background, and then I'll illustrate the rich logical thought through history, and then move to the later development. I'll talk about influence from India and Western traditions and the issues being debated right now. Let us imagine for a moment that we are traveling with a time machine, and our destination is 2,500 years ago, the warring states in ancient China. You can see from the map there were several states fighting with each other back then, and this was era of great culture and philosophical thought. And it's also well known for its various schools that held different thoughts and ideas, competing freely with each other. It is so-called the contention of 100 schools. Also, then the Chinese logical thought was really flourishing, and the most prominent schools are these two: the school of Moism, which is famous for their contributions to logic and argumentation theory, and the Confucian school. Many people know the Confucian school, and they propose a theory of correcting names. We will see their ideas later on in this talk. In Hanfeizi, it says, those who are the most famous in this world are the Confucians and the Moists. You can see these two schools are very influential then. So for today's talk, I'm going to focus on only logical thought. These are the two very important references in this field. The first book is Graham's Later Moist Logic, Ethics and Science. It's a must-read book. And the second is Needman's book series, Science and Civilization in China, Volume 7. It's written by Christoph Hapsmeyer. And in the next part, I'll show you some concrete text on logical thought in various aspects. First, there were many studies on names in the pre-Qing period. For instance, the canons said that 所以谓名也，所谓实也，名实偶合也. In translation, what something is called by is its name. What is so called is the object. Matching name and object is relating. This is from the Moist canons, and the citation is from Graham's book. This numbering system is from Graham's book. So then in the same book, they also distinguish different kinds of names. They say 名达类思. There are three kinds of names: unrestricted, classifying, and private. For instance, what is the unrestricted name? For instance, like 物, thing is unrestricted. Horse is a classifying name, and a proper name, Jack, is a private name, 私名. To distinguish different kinds, the canons also say 款举不可之意，说在有。牛与马虽异，以牛有齿，马有尾，说牛之非马也不可。是具有，不偏有偏无，不偏有偏无有。So this is a long quote. It says, by referring arbitrarily, one cannot know differences explained by what they have. Although oxen are different from horses, it's inadmissible to use oxen having incisors and horses having tails as proof that oxen are not horses. These are things which they both have, not things which one has while the other does not. This is a very crucial idea. In fact, this idea was also used later on to say when you define a class, you have to capture the essential properties. 荀子 similarly also have, 荀子, as we know, is an influential representative of the Confucianist. According to him, there are first there are two kinds of names, 共名 and 别名. So like animals, the animal is a 共名, horse is called 别名. Then further inside 共名, you could also say there are special 共名. For instance, the 大共名. Like previously, thing is to him is 大共名. Proper name Confucius is 大别名. So this is from 荀子's rectification of names. Correctly using names was considered to be a crucial matter. So this is the conversation between Confucius and Zilu. It's very famous. Let me read part of it. If names are not correct, language is not in accordance with the truth of things. If language is not in accordance with the truth of things, affairs cannot be carried on to success. When affairs cannot be carried on to success, proprieties and music will not flourish. And then this lead to punishment. Punishment lead to people don't know how to move their hand or foot. So then the conclusion, therefore, a superior man, 君子, considers it necessary that the names he uses may be spoken appropriately, and also that what he speaks may be carried out appropriately. So a final sentence, what the superior man requires is just that in his words, there may be nothing incorrect. So that's the rectification of names. We have to correct names first, make everything proper. So here I want to give you an example. Of course, this conversation shows how bad consequence it may lead to if one does not use name correctly. With the Confucians, correcting names is not only an issue in language, but also it's a social matter. A typical example we often hear is 君君臣臣父父子子. Let the king be a king, the minister a minister, the father a father, the son a son. So you can see that the two same Chinese characters are put together. The first one is a noun, a name, and the second one is a verb. This means the name should tell correctly how to act, for instance, as a king or as a father. From the discussion above about names, we can see that Asian Chinese philosophers are concerned with the relationship between language, we talk a lot about names, and reality. And they realized that there are various kinds or classes, and they try to identify the difference or similarities between those different kinds. And finally, we have seen the Confucius school also use language to regulate social behaviors. In fact, if you think of those matters, you are already at a quite abstract level. This is, of course, a very good background for logical thought, further logic formalism to develop. Next, we look at the argumentation theory. Once you have reasoning, you want to argue for something or against something, and then it comes to the argumentation theory. Both Xunzi and Mozi emphasize that to distinguish truth from falsehood, besides considering sameness and difference in kinds, we should also provide sufficient arguments. Xunzi says, 辩则禁固. In argumentation, one should list all the reasons. And the Moist also said, 以说出故. By means of inference, bring out reasons. So you can see that actually reasons, as reasons for the argument is very important there in their context. So let's look at a few examples again from the Moist canons. So for instance, let's consider the law of non-contradiction first. The Moist canons already propose this basic principle regulating the disputations. 事不具当，不具当必或不当。或 is or. So in translation it says, of two contradictory propositions, one must be false. They cannot be true at the same time. If you have learned a little bit logic, this is the basic law in logic, right? You cannot say both contradictory propositions, both are true. One of them must be false. So this is also very basic. In logic, you have to be consistent, right? You cannot be self-contradictory. Next is the law of excluded middle. The canons again says, 未辩无胜，必不当说在辩. Two contradictory propositions cannot be both false. One of them must be true. So this is a slightly different from the previous law, but this is saying you have to have a definite attitude, right? Two contradictory propositions cannot be both false. You have to say one of them must be true. This is usually in logic called the law of excluded middle. And now in the Moist text, it's applied in argumentation, 辩. Actually, if you are interested in discussions on those general principles in the history of logic, in China, you can see a German philosopher, Gregor Paul's work. He has written several papers on this topic. Next, let's look at some interesting paradoxes. Paradox is usually as a criteria for measuring to see whether the level of the logic thinking, how much we can think of logic. If you feel puzzled, you feel something is a paradox, it shows there's a logic going on. One is trying to get general logic principles. So the first one is this one. It says 以言为镜背，背说在其言. To claim that all saying contradicts itself is self-contradictory, explained by what he says himself. So if you are familiar with the Western tradition in logic, this is very close to the paradox of Creighton's paradox, because Creighton says Cretans are always liars. You may have heard about liar paradox, but that's from Creighton. These Cretans are always liars, said by Creighton. So here 以言为禁背 itself is 背. And another paradox is also interesting. 以学为无益也教背. Teaching someone that learning is useless is self-contradictory. Since someone learns that learning is useless, itself is the learning, right? That's why it's a paradox. This has been considered a criticism of Taoism, because Taoism advocates 无为, non-action, right? 以学为无益. So this is a typical Taoist statement. Okay, finally, let's look at something about a very important topic, inference. It was commonly held across different schools that one should infer from what one knows to what one does not know to get new knowledge. The general term to denote this process is called 说, reasoning or provide proofs. As in, we have seen already, by means of inference, bring out reasons. And then also in the canons, it said about the knowledge, sources of the knowledge. There are 3 different ways to get knowledge. Learning from others, 知闻说清. Learning from others, reasoning from what one knows already, consulting experience. As we know, epistemology is about knowledge, like sources of knowledge, and reasoning about knowledge. We can see already in the canons, there's a clear explanation on this. And then to distinguish these 3 ways of obtaining knowledge, there's a very good example given in the canons. Let's look at it together. Jack stands outside the room and sees a white object. His observation tells him the object outside is white. Inside the room is another object, and Jack is told it has the same color as the one outside. Now he knows the inside object has the same color as the one outside by learning from others, because others told him. Finally, he knows the object in the room is white by his own reasoning, based on what he knows, based on his observation, based on other people tells him, and then he reasons. He gets the new knowledge. The object in the room is white. So in the Moist canons, there are several reasoning patterns studied. The first, I'll say just a few ones and show you mostly examples. The first one is called P. 辟也者，据他物而以明之. Illustrating is that in order to make someone else know one thing, you refer to a different thing known. So you use something this person know already, and to make the person know something he hadn't know. So that's basically the reasoning pattern P. So the example, that's a good example. Mozi, we know Mozi is the founder of the Moist school. Mozi met a king of the state Chu to convince the Chu that it's not right for the rich Chu to invade the poor state Song. He used a more clear example. It's not right for rich people to leave their property and go robbing poor people. So using example about people, rich people, poor people, and the property, and he's trying to convince the king of the Chu not to invade the state Song. Since the king sees the injustice of the latter, he realized that of the former. So this is this is the example taken to be as a P. This chapter is this is from the chapter 公书. And the second reasoning pattern is called 推。推也者，以其所不取之，同于其所取者， 语之也. By the way, the translation here I'm using in my talk today is all taken from Graham's book. Inferring is using what is the same in that which he refuses to accept and that which he does accept in order to propose the former. This is a bit difficult to understand what they're saying. Let's again look at an example, 3 example. 公梦, this is from chapter 公梦. 公梦 does not think gods or ghosts exist, but still he claims that 君子 should learn how to pray. Then Moses said, what Gongmen said is like saying you must learn how to treat your guests well, but there's no guest. It's also like having to make a fish net, but there's no fish. The absurdity of the latter cases is clear. So what Gongmen said must be wrong. So those are very interesting examples. You can see how the logic reasoning was there. And then the most fascinating example actually is called Mo. It's translated as paralyzing. 谋也者必辞而拒行. Paralyzing is comparing propositions and then letting all proceed. Again, this translation is very abstract. So in the canons, there are several different kinds of different categories of the examples under the name of a mo. So here in today's talk, I just show you 2 kinds. One is called 示而然. A typical example is this. 白马马也, 乘白马乘马也. A white horse is a horse. To ride a white horse is to ride horses. Let me already introduce you the form. N1 is N2. N here is noun phrase. 白马马也, noun phrase. Verb. We add verb plus noun phrases. Verb plus noun phrases. We have the same verb. VN1 is VN2. So this is the form we use to formalize this sentence, this reasoning. And another kind is called 视而不然. 其弟美人也, 爱其弟, 非爱美人也. Her younger brother is a handsome man. Loving her younger brother is not loving handsome man. Again, here you see it's not. Different from the first case, 视而不然. This is VN1 is not VN2. So here there's a research question. So in the canons, we can see various examples, but there's a research question one can ask. Why are 示而然 examples valid, considered to be correct? And 视而不然 is giving us counterexamples. So to answer this question, there are lots of research going on. In my early work, I did with Zhang Jialong, we introduced the considerations of monotonicity. So what is monotonicity? Let's look at this simple example. If some dogs walked, then some animals walked. So this example, this is considered to be a typical example of an upward monotonicity inference. That was considered in medieval Western logic and revived in its modern variants of natural logic. The reason why this implication can proceed is that the interpretation of animals is an extension of that of dogs. Once you have dogs, then you can move upwards to animals. When we have some dogs walked, some quantifier is very important here. Some dogs walked. It creates a positive and up entailing environment for the predicate dog. So then we can move upwards and get some animals walked. So this is basically the idea. We take monotonicity reasoning to analyze the mode reasoning. And then with my student, Sun Ziqiang, we continue this approach. If you are interested, we have a new paper. I'll give you the reference information later on. But this monotonicity reasoning has really lots of background, has been developed from 1970s. Oh, I see one question. Maybe I should answer this question in order to be. What's the difference between moist and Western logic? So so far the Western logic. Let me quickly say a few words. Western logic started from Aristotle. I think you may heard about syllogism, 三段论, huh? So typical example is say all people would die, someone is a people, and someone would die. So something like that. All animals can walk. A dog is an animal. A dog can walk. For instance, like this reasoning is typical Aristotle's logic, syllogism. But Western logic has a systematic development in the history from Aristotle, later in medieval logic, then later on to modern mathematical logic. So that's the logic. Actually, I'm now doing research a lot in that direction. But the moist logic, that's why I'm now telling you the history of the moist logic is from the pre-Qin period. And in fact, after the unification of China, Qin dynasty, the moist school, the moist school, also other schools, many schools were not be able to continue. So that's why the moist logic as a formal subject, as a subject, was not being developed systematically. So we are now looking at the old texts and trying to figure out what were the moist thinking about, what their logic thought. If they were given an opportunity to develop, what would be the formulas they could develop? That's basically my general background, why I'm now going through the history here. But later I'll also introduce you interaction between the Chinese tradition. There are more later ideas which related to logic, but logic is not developed as a subject as in the West. I hope this, I will check this from time to time. Let me continue. Actually, this part I'm not going to say much, because this is really the research project. We are trying to figure out what are the reasoning patterns when the moist give the example, whether they are thinking of. I got another question. Why was Confucianism established as the orthodox ideology of China's ancient feudal dynasties after the Han dynasty? That's a history, right? You ask why. I think the why question, your answer can be found in history. So here, I want to emphasize more logical thought and ideas. So partly maybe I could answer, my lecture will answer your question, but I think why, you ask a why question, maybe you could find more proper answers in the Chinese history. Let me go back. So I'll skip these several slides here. It's all about research around the mole reasoning pattern. So, but it will be also instructive to look at other examples, not only talking about white horse, but also black horse, female slave, male slave. Those are the very vivid examples from the canons. 视而不染, female slave, younger brother, carriage, boat, robbers. There are a lot of interesting examples. It's really interesting. And one thing I wanted to emphasize here, is actually in the Chinese language of that period. There's no explicit marking for singular or plural, and object nouns are not modified by determiners. Those are the words we now know, right? We have in English language or in Chinese, we know if we want to distinguish a singular or plural noun, we could say 我,我们, 他,他们, right? So you have those indicators. But in the Chinese language back then, nothing about this. Just to take the example, 乘白马, 乘白马, could mean, because 白马, nothing in front of 白马, so it could mean ride the white horse, or a white horse, or some white horse, or all white horses. So you could add those determiners, articles, and then the reasoning would be very different if you add different quantifiers. That's actually the core idea we take up the monotonicity reasoning as a format, as a formalism to analyze the reasoning. So I'll also skip this. Those are the research, if you are interested in, this is the paper, the inference pattern mode in moist logic, a monotonicity reasoning view. Let me move on to later development. This is actually the second question touched a little bit. Because after the unification of China, the ideas of Confucianism and the legal ideas have been dominant. But many other schools did not continue. Of course, Taoism continued somehow, but in fact, many of the moist ideas survived under later dynasties. For instance, the relation between names, language, and objects was a core issue in the period of Beijing. This is really continued the tradition of names in different schools. We have seen a lot of ideas about names, theories about names, kinds. But when the Beijing period, when they discuss 言不尽意, 言尽意, Wang Bi's famous view, 言不尽意. So those issues really referred back to the pre-Qing period. And then in Song Dynasty, people talk a lot about knowledge and also the relation between knowledge and action. So those are important developments. But I'm not going to say much about the content given the time. I want to focus later on the later influences from Indian and Western tradition. So Indian tradition, again, I'll say only briefly, but I'll say more about Western tradition. So the Indian Hitovidya was introduced to China. Hitovidya usually is called Yinming in Chinese. This is the earliest Indian logic. Was introduced to China in the 6th century. It became very popular in the Tang Dynasty and expanded its influence to other Asian countries, for instance, Japan and Korea. This is Xuanzang, who went to India and brought back lots of canons of the Buddhists. So there are two routes of this transmit knowledge from India to China through Tibet or directly, usually called 藏传移民和汉传移民, these two routes. In fact, in the Tibetan monasteries, the argumentation tradition is still kept. It's really fun. If you have a chance, you can go to the Tibetan monastery and observe how they debate. But in the history, however, there was very little development during the Song Yuanming dynasties. Very little development of Indian logic. Only in the late Qin dynasty, several scholars got interested in Yogacara, Wei Shi Zhong, and then the studies on Hitovidya were resumed. There's a lot of interesting materials about Indian logic, but that's not my focus for today. I see another question from Wei Ye Jing. I think please wait, and you will your question will be answered later on. So let us move to the interaction between Chinese and Western traditions. In the 16th and 17th century, many Jesuits came to China. The history of missions of the Jesuits in China is part of the history of relations between China and the Western world. From now on, I'll take just one example. Matteo Ricci, this guy, on the left side. I suppose many of you have heard about his story. He arrived in China in 1583 and stayed in China until he died in 1610. He introduced the Western science, mathematics, astronomy, visual arts to the imperial court and carried on significant intercultural and philosophical dialogue with Chinese scholars, particular representatives of Confucianism. The person on the right side is called Xu Guanqi. So with Xu Guanqi, he translated Euclidean's Elements into Chinese in 1607. So this is only one Jesuit. There are so many Jesuits came to China. So they really played very important role in terms of interaction between Chinese and Western traditions. And this was continued in the early 20th century. More logic textbooks were translated. The Chinese version of Mill's System of Logic, 目论明学, System of Logic, appeared in 1905. It was translated by Yan Fu, a very famous scholar and translator. Ye Fan's Elementary Lessons on Logic was also translated in 1907. So here there's a very interesting story I want to share with you. The Chinese first translated a System of Logic, which they find strange, but perhaps make a sort of weird sense. And then they translate Mill's Liberty, 论自由, which they find much stranger already. Finally, they were really shocked when translating Mill's third book on the subjection of a woman. So the first book, A System of Logic, the second on liberty, the third on the subjection of a woman. Clearly, logic was not just a harmless hobby, but it could lead to positive absurd views like that of a woman having equal right to men. So in 1920, Russell, a British logician, mathematician, philosopher, visited Beijing and gave a lecture series on mathematical logic. And this is a collection of his lectures published recently. So I got one more question from the same Wei Ye Jing. I think your question is very good. Let's leave it. This is a very general question. Let's leave it for the Q&A session. So in encountering Western logics and Western traditions, Chinese scholars then very naturally start to compare traditions and wonder whether there had been any logic in the Chinese tradition. Of course, some claim that China did not have logic. That is why we failed in the process of modernization. But others said that we had. Among those who think there was logic, different views exist concerning what kind of logic it was. I'll mention some views later on. So this controversy has lasted till today. If you read the history of Chinese logic literature, there are still lots of discussions about this issue. I think for now, let us look at a famous view from eminent scholar Zhang Shizhao. In his book, 逻辑指要, he wrote, 寻逻辑之名起于欧洲，而逻辑之理从乎天然。The name logic was initiated in Europe, but the principles of logic exist everywhere. So I think this says a lot. I don't need to give any explanation. Later on in 1930s, I'm going through the history. I think many, if you look at the history, you will see, especially the fourth question, you will see what's happening in the history and nowadays. In 1930s and also 40s, there was a generation of logicians who had studied abroad and go back to China, started teaching modern logics in Chinese universities. For instance, Jin Yueling. Jin Yueling started the Department of Philosophy at our university, Tsinghua University, and taught logic here. He taught modern logic, like Russell's logic at Tsinghua. And he educated many well-known logicians in China, but also worldwide. For instance, Wang Xianjun, those are his students. Wang Xianjun first worked at Tsinghua, then later moved to Peking University, spent his whole life in Peking University. Shen Youding first at Tsinghua, worked at Tsinghua, then later on went to Academy of Social Sciences. Wang Hao, usually if you are reading English literature, they put Hao Wang. Hao Wang was also Jin Yueling's student, and he went to Harvard. Harvard did his PhD with Quine, and eventually he was a professor in Oxford, Harvard, several major universities. And if you look at history, this is a very important period that lots of logicians were produced, so to speak. In 1980s, China opened up again. As we know, many more exchange programs were carried out, and also including logic. So we have more logicians going abroad and foreigners coming to China. And if you look at now, the current situation, modern logic is taught in all major Chinese universities. That's a very good thing. In 1990s, there was a big debate. I think many people are aware of this big debate. The debate is about whether there was a Chinese logic. Of course, this is a debate against a bigger debate, whether there's a Chinese philosophy, 中国哲学. Some scholars think that we did have 易学, 经学, 玄学, 儒学, 道学. That's a lot. But we do not have 哲学. 哲学 philosophy is a Western concept. In Chinese tradition, we don't have this concept. So similarly, also, whether there was a Chinese logic or 逻辑学. So the debate I was mentioned earlier. Lots of discussions about this. So some scholars think there were only 民学 and 辩学. 民学 is the theory of names. 辩学 is theory of argumentation. So they think there are only 民学 and 辩学 because this is prominent in the pre-Qing period, and not logic. And other scholars think that there truly was Chinese logic. Also, the second view also thinks the second view holds that we share logic principles. It does not matter whether we call it logic or something else, similar to what Zhang Shizhou said. Among those who think that there truly was logic in China, still there are very different views. Some people think the Chinese logic is a traditional formal logic. It's already formal. Some think it's a mixture of a formal logic, dialectic logic, and methodology. And some think it's rather informal logic. Of course, there's still yet another view proposing to use modern logic that we are doing research with as a tool to better understand Asian Chinese logic. Yeah, so this debate has been going on for many decades already. Still, the big questions remain. For instance, why was logic not developed in China so well as in the West? I just answered one question about Aristotle, Western logic, right? Western logic has a systematic development from Aristotle to Frege, Russell. Nowadays, it has been developed, continued being developed. We could ask why was logic not developed in China so well? Of course, there were some development. I mentioned Beijing discussion. There are Song ideas that in various dynasties. There are interesting ideas, although it's not so systematic. The second question is, if the Moist continue to thrive, what would be the possible logical formalism? I don't know whether the audience have learned some logic. In the Western logic, you could go very abstract mathematical formalism. If you are doing mathematical logic, say first order logic, then things are all represented by symbols, right? That's the format of Western logic. But if we think about the Chinese tradition, let's think about, assume the Moist ideas can be continued to be developed. What would be the possible formalism? This is interesting to think about, because Western tradition has this alpha beta tradition, and Chinese has our character tradition. And maybe we end up with something using character to represent concrete things, using character as a symbol formalist. And then finally, do we human beings across the globe, right, share the same logic principles? Do we share the same logic, or we have completely different logic? We cannot communicate. So those are the very big questions. I invite everyone who are now taking this class to think about. And there may be no immediate answer. So that's why I want to, in the next few slides, I want to tell you what I'm doing now. I'm involved in several big or small projects with my students and my colleagues. This is the book I edited with Jeremy Seliman, who is a Jin Yuelin professor at Tsinghua, professor in Auckland University in New Zealand. So this is a book of collection of the interviews with well-known, about 25 well-known logicians and historian of Chinese logic. It's very interesting to see their views, how they see issues in the history of Chinese logic in the context of a comparison, again, with Indian tradition, with Western tradition. And then we are also working on this very big project a handbook of the history of logical thought in China. I'm working with Jeremy and Zhai Jinteng, a professor from Nanking University. This is the main part. And it has been already 10 years. We hope this book will be appear this year. We are almost done. So this book has 40 authors from China, but also international colleagues, various places. And if you read this book, you will get a full picture on the history of Chinese logic. And also to facilitate the handbook project, we started the Holic History of Logic in China workshop from 2010. And this has been organized already several editions. And the forthcoming edition is now in about 10 days, January 15th to 17th this year. And those are the keynote speakers. In the middle, you can see He Moye, Christoph Habsmeyer, Fen Yaoming from Hong Kong, Taiwan, Dirk Mayer from Oxford. If you are interested in, you can check our website, Joint Research Center website. And you are very welcome to join us on this workshop. And finally, those are the previous works I have done with various colleagues, students. If you are interested in, you can also look at what we are doing. Those are more research-oriented works. Okay, I think I am more or less cover what I wanted to say. Let me see the time. Okay, I'm a little bit faster than planned. It's 23. But in any case, let me first finish this lecture. Thank you, everyone. I don't know whether you are online here or somewhere. Thank you for your patience. Let me end this session. Thank you. I think we will have a Q&A session soon.